Well, let's get started. I'm going to use this just so it records. We're really honored to have the kickoff seminar this year for the Center for Clinical Trials to be given by Harry Marks. Harry, looking out, I think most of you know him. He's associate professor in the Institute of the History of Medicine here at Johns Hopkins, where he holds the Elizabeth Tridy and A. McGehee Harvey Professorship in the History of Medicine. I have to ask you later about what their relationship is, since it's
husband and wife.
Husband and wife.
Husband and wife. And if you go in the main entrance of the hospital and turn a little bit to your right down the corridor, there's a picture of Dr. Harvey, who was chief of medicine at the hospital for many years.
Okay. And his wife was Elizabeth Tridy.
Yeah.
Okay. So Harry holds adjunct appointments also in the Department of Epidemiology here in the school and the Departments of History and Anthropology. Most importantly, I think, is he's a faculty member in the Center of Clinical Trials, and we're lucky to have his insight and wisdom at our seminars and our faculty meetings and in the classroom. So I'll tell you a little bit about Harry. He's written and teaches about the history of clinical medicine, disease, and public health. And his interests also include the history of drug regulation in the U.S. and Europe. And he's the author of a very important book in clinical trials. And if you haven't read it, go out and get it right now. It should be on everybody's bookshelf in this room. It's a wonderful book, The Progress of Experiment, Science, and Therapeutic Reform in the United States, 1900 to 1990. Now, this book also has been translated into French. My French is such that I'd rather not show what my accent's really like, but the important thing is that it has anthropology in the title.
Yes, so the French decided that it was really a book about the history and anthropology of clinical trials. I had nothing to do with this, but I have some weird pheromones, and anthropologists are attracted by them, which is how I happen to have an appointment in our Department of Anthropology.
He's an advisor and contributor to the James Lynn Library, a repository of innovations in clinical trials, and he's a co-investigator of Project Impact, a collaborative project to identify the 100 most important clinical trials since 1948. So I'm going to turn it over to Harry Marks.
Okay, well, thank you. You know, it is true, one, that I've been a follower here for a long time, asking obnoxious questions, so now it's your turn to strike back. Two, I don't think there are a lot of people or institutions who could have gotten me to give a talk this fall. I've been preoccupied with other things, and so I welcome the opportunity. The original invite was to talk about a historical clinical trial, and since I've written about all the historical clinical trials I decided to propose something different. So what I want to do today, and I've changed the title slightly to Tales of Avandia, but here's what I want to do. I assume most of you have seen one or the other of these headlines about Avandia, which is a drug of GlaxoSmithKline's, hereafter GSK, for type 2 diabetes. And there are a whole bunch of current issues about Avandia. How well a job is the FDA doing balancing drug safety and efficacy? What kinds of studies count as evidence of risk and benefit? That is to say, can you use meta-analyses or observational studies? And then this third thing that now appears to be lurking, which was there either incompetence or fraud on the part of GSK regarding the drug's cardiovascular effects? And these are all very significant clinical issues. These are all very significant regulatory issues. And I don't want to belittle their importance. Nonetheless, I have no special competence to address any of them. And what I want to talk about instead, for the most part, I'll come back to Avandia toward the end, is a framework that might help to understand, long before the molecules from which Avandia is derived came into somebody's imagination, the issues that shaped the history of this drug. And those issues are, how does a disease come into existence? How do we begin to think about a disease for which a drug is used? How do you measure its therapeutic benefit? How does the FDA then adjudicate evidence of drug hazards? And what is their role in regulating the clinical use of drugs? So 2/3 of the talk is really going to be about this background. And I think if you've been following Avandia, you'll get the connections, and if not, I will try and draw some out at the end. So the roadmap is, for a while, disease concepts of diabetes, the history of surrogate endpoints at the FDA, drug labels, drug regulation and clinical practice, what's the relationship, and then ultimately we will get to Avandia. So let me start with what's the disease. So-called type 2, non-insulin dependent diabetes, maybe it has another name now, I'm not sure, is basically a condition that usually appears in adulthood, unlike juvenile diabetes, type 1. And although insulin is not required to keep these patients alive, a lot of these patients over the last 40 years have been taking insulin, probably an increasing number. And a framework gets developed in the 1950s that I'm going to talk about for a while. And the theory is that everybody in this room, everybody on the planet is a pre-diabetic, potentially, okay? And some of those pre-diabetics will become chemical diabetics. I'll talk about that. And then we will get over diabetes. Now, what's chemical diabetes? Well, let's start with that. What it means is you use, I'm not sure what the current diagnostic measures are, but back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a glucose tolerance test. You're given an abnormal amount of highly concentrated glucose, and if there is any abnormality in your body's ability to clear that insulin, poof, you're a chemical diabetic, okay? In addition, the people introducing what was essentially a new disease state argued it's on a continuum, that these people are going to become those people, okay? J.W. Kahn, University of Michigan, 1958 Banting lecture. What may be regarded as pre-diabetic today will later to be shown to be a clear manifestation that the disease is present. So this is a monolithic disease that is very, very influential in the diabetes community. All right, and in the States at least, whoops, did we lose a slide? I lost a slide. All right, in the States at least, the most vocal proponents are of this model are a group in New York and a group up at the Joslin Clinic in Boston. And they all believe that the complications of diabetes, macrovascular, microvascular, are intrinsic to the disease, and you have to aggressively manage, at that time, blood glucose levels, now hemoglobin 1AC, and they extended the logic of this notion of the disease to chemical diabetes. You've got to find these people and get them into treatment. Okay. Now, this would be a kind of historical footnote, except that, as Jeremy Green has shown in this book, which probably also should be on the reading list, it's about the long history of the relationship between scientific medicine and corporate promotion of drugs. The Upjohn Company, which introduces the oral hypoglycemic oronase, known to many of you as tobutamide, decided to promote very heavily this idea of chemical diabetes as part of its initial marketing campaign. And it begins, the drug is introduced in 57, begins by introducing oronase as an alternative to insulin, but by the end of that decade, and certainly into the 60s, Upjohn salespeople are emphasizing diagnostic screening to detect, quote, the 1.5 estimated undiagnosed diabetics. And all of this is laid out in Jeremy's book, and I'm just stealing from it shamelessly. And then this idea of chemical diabetes is also very heavily promoted at scientific meetings, at conferences, etc. And all of these marketing campaigns are scientific successes and they're commercial successes. Okay, so here's a Oranase ad, and it's meant to show year by year the number of people who are on their drug. It's an Upjohn ad, but it is also meant to metaphorically illustrate the spectrum of disease. As the spectrum broadens, you get more and more people involved. Now, I'll come back to Oranase in a while. What I'm trying to underscore here is there's this model of disease. It says, let's use these drugs aggressively if people who are potentially diabetic or people who are actively diabetic with type 2 diabetes are not treated, they will die. Okay? And this becomes increasingly gospel in the diabetes community. And it's reinforced in some weird ways. When, in fact, evidence comes out from the diabetes complications, DCCT, Diabetes Complications and Control Trial, which is entirely about juvenile diabetes, which is a totally distinct disease with a very different pathophysiology, with a very different genetic profile, that gets used in arguments that, well, maybe we ought to treat type 2 diabetics the same way. So this is a very pervasive belief. And even though people write editorials saying, well, maybe we shouldn't make this analogy. And there's a British study, much contested, the UK Diabetes Complications Study, which does use the oral hypoglycemics and make a similar sort of argument. So now I'm at part 2 of this history. Disease is over for the minute. And that is surrogate endpoints at the FDA. So in the 90s, the FDA is under a lot of pressure, early 90s, from HIV activists. Where are the drugs? We're dying. And it's been under pressure for a while from people in industry, people in the medical community. Why are you taking so long to approve our drugs? Patients are dying of other conditions. In the wake of this pressure, the FDA issues a set of regulations that say, well, even if you can't show me the clinical benefit, if I have a good set of reasons for thinking there's a surrogate endpoint, some kind of biomarker, viral reproduction rate, CD4 counts in the case of HIV, as it will happen, hemoglobin 1AC in the case of diabetes, I'm going to allow you to market this drug. And this FDA position, we can skip that, is hinged with a whole lot of conditions. I have abstracted from about 15 pages of the Federal Register the core points. You have to show some plausibility that these surrogate endpoints have some connection to clinical outcomes. So you have some reason for believing it, and you have to convince us. Biological plausibility, it's a predictor of disease progression, etc. And we're allowed to say when we approve a drug on the basis of a surrogate endpoint, but you have to start today a study, an RCT, one or more, with a clinical endpoint to make this link realistic. But in the meantime, you can market your drug. And this starts as a set of regulations for life-threatening illnesses, but when seized in the 90s, the acceptance and the issuance of guidelines about how to use surrogate endpoints for all kinds of diseases that are not, in the original sense, life-threatening. And those are handled on a case-by-case basis. So what's the consequence? I have a new antihypertensive drug. I don't have to show you that that's going to reduce strokes. I just have to show you that will reduce blood pressure. Because we know on the basis of clinical trials, RCTs, we know on the basis of epidemiological evidence, a reduction in blood pressure does lead to a reduction in strokes. So I will approve your drug. Same logic for approving diabetes drugs. A couple of other footnotes, but they're important. There's a lot of evidence here, and I'll go through it with the Avandia case particularly, that although the FDA says you're going to have to do a clinical trial to show me clinical benefit, in fact, a very small proportion of these studies are ever completed. And the FDA does not have the capacity through the 90s to track them. And anybody who's been involved in recruitment for a trial knows, well, yeah, gee, I can go to my doctor tells me to take this drug, I can get it. Would you like to be in an RCT where you might get the drug? I don't think so. Okay, now, third part of the history. So, again, surrogate markers would not be important if once you began to get signals that there were serious adverse effects with a drug, the FDA could say, signals, good evidence, we only approve this provisionally, get it off the market, right? It's not what happens, and it's not so easy. And if you think getting a drug off the market once it's on is easy, you don't understand the FDA's legal powers, and you don't understand its very long regulatory history. What the FDA legally has the power to do is to say if a drug's going to be on the market, it has to be safe and effective for use under the conditions prescribed, recommended, or suggested in the proposed labeling thereof. Now, yes, the FDA can keep a drug from getting on the market, and it can even, in unusual circumstances, remove a drug from the market. But most of the notable cases where drugs are removed from the market, it's actually a manufacturing decision that their liability exposure is not worth what it's going to cost them to fight the FDA. On the other hand, the much more common outcome of these signals is you get the signals, the company says, I'm not backing down, I don't believe your data, or even just if I make enough noise, I can fight this, and meanwhile, my profits are increasing. Okay? So most of what happens when you begin this process of warning signals that the surrogate endpoints were not enough and that there are serious clinical hazards, most of what happens tend to be prolonged, I'm talking in some cases decades, but certainly 5, 6, 7, 8-year prolonged negotiations about the labeling and revising the labeling. What kind of a warning? How big is the typeface? Is it in a box or not in a box? And these go on and on and on. So let me run that through. There actually is a history of this, but what I want to underscore is the third point in this background. There's disease, there's the introduction of surrogate endpoints as a legitimate standard for allowing some drugs to enter the market, and then there's the real teeth in the FDA's powers are regulation of labeling. Okay? So let me go through that actually with Oronase, tolbutamide, because this could be a poster child for the limits of regulatory relabeling. You've all, probably most of you who are non-historians in the room, have had this in class here at the center, but you know there once was a study long ago called the University Diabetes Group study. It found, much to its surprise, that there was evidence that maybe Oronase was associated with higher levels of myocardial infarction, other myocardial ischemic events. And when the UGDP investigators report that data to the FDA says, okay, well, we should probably put a warning on the drug. And there ensues a multi-year conflict about what kind of a warning the FDA could require Upjohn to put on Oronase. Upjohn's support comes from the Joslin Clinic people, other groups, a group that gets formed called the Committee for the Care of the Diabetic. It has a lot of backing in what I like to think of as the throwaway medical press. Those of you who go, as I do regularly, to the Sackler Museum, for which I am appreciative, should know that Arthur Sackler made his money pimping for the drug industry. Running a variety of newsletters and campaigns, including the one against the FDA and the UGDP. So UGDP has backers, Tom Chalmers, who is a mentor to Teddy and me, who does the initial reviews for NIH, the Biometric Society, every blue ribbon statistician at the time you could think of, biostatistician. And a lot of the debate over the FDA's action is really pursued in what I will loosely call the court of medical opinion and in various versions of the press. So all I'm doing with Oronase is just telling, and UGDP is telling you, look, this is a good example of what happens, which is you get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years of negotiations about what the labeling for this drug should say, and meanwhile, it's on the market. Now that depends on the company deciding, I've got a valuable product here, I want to fight this, and being able to fight this. But one of the things that made them able to fight it in the Oronase case is this very profound belief in the diabetes community that controlling levels of blood glucose would control the real life-threatening, life-destroying complications of the disease. So that's sort of, yeah, those are their options. They can do other things. They can remove a drug from the market. There's also a kind of funny history of restricting drugs from use, putting conditions. You have to do certain tests if you're going to use the drug, and that actually goes back a pretty long time. I think L-Dopa is introduced for Parkinson's in the 50s or 60s. That's one of the first instances. So they have these powers, but I've never tried to count it, and it probably would be hard, but my quasi-subjective, quasi-quantitative impression is this is where the action is. Let's try and modify the drug labeling. You have a question?
What is Upjohn doing at this point in time in terms of, so this study is being published in the medical literature, like indicating that there's a...
So Upjohn is enlisting its own consultants. Yeah. Upjohn continues to market the drug.
So they're writing letters to doctors?
Yeah, well, no. They found people who agree with them, yeah, and those people are writing letters to doctors. And this is also, as I say, being heavily promoted. Upjohn does get involved in one of the lawsuits that indirectly is related to this story, which has to do with access to the raw data for the UGDP, and that goes to the Supreme Court, if I remember. So there's a lot of things going. It's complicated, but most of Upjohn's activity is behind the scenes, and a little bit of it is out front. But meanwhile, they're marketing the drug. Okay. Now, so I've given you a history story. Now, in general, we really are trained historians. I mean, I am a historian. To say, do not ever say unequivocally, well, this happened in the past. This is what's going to happen now. Don't you people understand the lessons of history, right? We're trained not to say that. And I'm not going to say that what happened in the past unequivocally will resemble what happened now. And Avandia in particular has some interesting features. Maybe we could do the handout now because I'm going to start with Avandia. This is just a timeline so you can track my story. This may end differently. I really can't tell. There are some. But what I hope I've done in giving you this historical framework is a different way of thinking about what's going on with Avandia. I mean, this is what I'm trying to do this morning. And maybe I've altered some of your priors about what is going to happen with Avandia, but we don't do fortune telling. We're not allowed to. They'll pull my appointment. Okay, so Avandia. Avandia is initially approved by the FDA on May 25th, 1999. I've given you a very abbreviated chronology here. It's approved on the basis of a surrogate endpoint. It can achieve glycemic control in diabetics. It's initially approved for use either on its own as monotherapy or in combination with metformin, an older, much older, oral hypoglycemic, and then GSK, it starts being SmithKline, it then gets merged, Glaxo acquires it, so I'm going to say GSK as a shorthand. It then gets approved for additional indications, including use with other oral hypoglycemics with insulin, but in each case, it's improved glycemic control that is the basis for the approval. Now, the initial 1999 letter says very clearly, you're going to have to do a long-term 4-year study of the drug's efficacy and safety using clinical endpoints. At that time, myocardial ischemia and myocardial ischemic events were not on the horizon. The main concerns were concerns with other drugs in Avandia's molecular class, so their hepatotoxicity, and a little later heart failure, but the heart failure syndrome is very distinct from the myocardial one. Now, already by the fall of 2000, so spring of 99, by the fall of 2000, the FDA is starting to send what will be an almost unending, uninterrupted stream of warning letters to GSK saying, in your literature, in your presentations at scientific meetings, sponsored scientific meetings, whatever the forum is, you are underplaying the risks of this drug, and you are overplaying its benefits. And these warning letters keep coming. And sometimes they lead to revisions in the labeling, and sometimes they don't. But it doesn't matter, because then we're out 2 more years and there's another set of warning labels about some other similar sort of promotion. But what I want to point out here is, what's the FDA doing? It's basically invoking its labeling powers and its powers to say, we can regulate corporate speech, and you are going across a line that you're not supposed to. By the terms on which we approve your drug, you're not supposed to go across this line. Okay, 2001, you begin to get some new reports of adverse events. Once again, they get warned. Now we're still in the territory of hepatotoxicity, possible heart failure. Now, the next major public event, and since the July 13th, 14th marathon meeting of the FDA advisory committees, I'll talk about that in a minute, of this year, there's now some evidence, documentary evidence, that behind the scenes the FDA is getting nervous about all this. But the next public event comes in May of 2000. Cleveland Clinic, Steve Nissen, publishes a meta-analysis of 40 studies. And according to Nissen's analysis, there's an increased incidence of heart attacks among patients taking Avandia. Glaxo's response is to release an interim analysis of a very different kind of trial that it's doing for the European drug regulatory authorities, nothing to do with the FDA. And they say, well, we don't see it in our RCT. We don't believe in meta-analyses. Now, what I want to emphasize simply on Avandia, and I understand that Steve and Tom Lewis and some other people will be conducting a seminar starting in the second quarter and running through to 2012, discussing all the methodological issues. And is that right, Professor Goodman? Both of these analyses, and this will continue to be the story, have real serious methodological limits. And as I say, there are other people around here that understand these better than I. But in the Nissen case, the studies he's looking at really weren't intended to look at cardiovascular events. There's no patient-level data in the Nissen case, although there are subsequent FDA and other meta-analyses that have access to patient-level data. The study designs that they're summarizing are all over the map, and going along with the fact that they weren't intended to look at cardiovascular mortality in the first place, there's no central adjudication in any of these studies, or most of these studies, as to what a cardiovascular event is. Okay, lots of limitations, right? Meta-analysis 101. Should we be lumping these together? Should we be using all these studies? Okay, take Goodman's class. The record study, which is the Glaxo study, both in its interim version and in its final version, has a lot of other issues. It's an open label study. Okay, so there are real questions about who's being assigned to what drug, but more importantly, who is identifying potential infarct patients. Since everyone knows what all the treating investigators know, who's on what drug. It's a non-inferiority design, okay, about which there are all kinds of methodological issues. And the FDA pretty much says at a number of points, look, you did this for Europe. If you had come to us saying this is the kind of study you want to do, we wouldn't have allowed this particular design, okay? And then it is now clear that there are real differences among the clinical sites in the rates of referral to hospital for various clinical endpoints. So neither of these evidentiary positions, let's call them, is clear-cut and dominant, right, in the Avandia case. I mean, you could teach any one of them as a lesson in how not to do either a meta-analysis or a clinical trial. Again, I defer to Steve. And in the interim analysis, it's even worse because the study isn't completed, they don't have a lot of events, and so it's not clear to me entirely why the New England Journal even published the damn thing. But it did. Okay. So, what happens in 2007 after Nissen publishes? What happens is the FDA goes to its metabolic and endocrine advisory panel, the diabetologists, and they say, oh no, we need this drug. We can't take it off the market. So what happens? We get a new label, which is this class of drugs in addition to its known effects, congestive heart failure in some patients, show increased risk of angina or MI according to this meta-analysis. Big box. This is sort of the nastiest thing the FDA can do. It's in no position to remove the drug from the market when its advisory committee overwhelmingly says, we need this drug, the evidence is not strong enough, etc. That's 2007. Meanwhile, millions, I don't have access to the therapeutic, the NTIS marketing data, but apparently millions of doses of this drug were and are being still sold at this point. So what do we have on my reading of Avandia in light of the past? Well, you've got some new but hardly secure evidence that there may be some ischemic risk. You don't have any hard data yet about the drug's clinical benefits. Because remember, what's it approved on? It's approved initially on the basis of glycemic control. And there's a very long chain of inference you have to follow out to believe that there are clinical benefits that go with that in the case of this drug. Okay? On the other hand, they're getting their advice from a diabetes community that's strongly committed to glycemic control. What the FDA did in 2007 is probably as strong an action as it could have taken vis-a-vis Avandia under these circumstances. This didn't keep people like Nissen, people like Bruce Satie and Kurt Furberg from saying, yeah, we've been telling you people all along, that's the problem with these goddamn surrogate endpoint approvals. They don't necessarily link to clinical outcomes. And I'll go into that a little more in a minute. So that's 2007, publicly, 2008, a little quiet. There are beginning to be some internal discussions about this issue of surrogate endpoints and cardiovascular effects, specifically in oral diabetes drugs, at the FDA. And the warnings, this is another one, and it's about a web promotion of GSK, say, hey, you don't communicate any risk information? What about our labeling? And this is actually a letter that goes out about 2 or 3 of these Glaxo drugs. You had a question?
the FDA waiting for people like Nissen to do meta-analysis in public?
No, it would basically, yeah.
What are they doing in-house in terms of?
I'll get to that. Okay, there's a little bit, but it's simulated. As far as I know, they're doing nothing until Nissen. Okay, then there are things stimulated, and they're particularly stimulated by a chain of events that starts in 2009. So give me 5 minutes to finish, maybe less, and then we can have a lot of time to talk. Okay. So, August 2009. Glaxo, which has done the record study, controlled clinical trial, was specifically aimed at cardiovascular myocardial events, but it's being done for Europe. FDA hasn't had much to do with its design, but Glaxo submits it to the FDA and says, we want broader approvals and we want this warning to take the place of the existing warning, and everything in red and crosses out myocardial ischemia. This is Glaxo's proposed analysis. Okay. February of this year, Chuck Grassley, plague of many people, senator from Iowa, releases internal reports that are coming out of not the drug division of the FDA, but David Graham's office, epidemiology and surveillance. And Graham is taking a very hard line that FDA should be removed from the market at this point. But there are a lot of fights around this. And moreover, Graham is arguing, according to Grassley's documents, that you can't study this drug. You can't do a new clinical trial of this drug because this drug is unsafe. So how could you consent people? And it's been proven unsafe. Okay. Margaret Hamburg, relatively newly appointed FDA commissioner, says, yes, Senator, thank you, Senator. We're concerned about this. We are dealing with it, and we will address this in this marathon meeting that we have now scheduled for mid-July of 2010. Again, part of the continuing course. Steve, you have an empirical question? Your hand's up. Oh, you're just stretching. Okay. All right. Yes, you may leave the room. The bathroom's down to your left. Okay. There's thousands of pages on the CEDAR website related to this meeting, background documents, slide presentations, internal, an 800-page memo of internal documents from 99 on. Have a good read, okay? I have not mastered them all, etc. FDA convenes an advisory committee. What's unusual about this advisory committee is it contains the usual endocrine and metabolic crowd. Individuals actually, even for that, are a little unusual, but nonetheless. But it also contains a totally separate panel meeting jointly of people who do trials in biostatistics and epidemiology for a living. People who are colleagues of yours. There's a listing. And after 2 days of testimony, slides, and discussions, and under considerable duress from the FDA staff, that you actually have to vote. That you can't say, well, on the one hand, but on the other hand. So it's a kind of forced vote. All right? But they make what is, for an advisory panel, a very unusual set of recommendations. 3 people say, this is cool, I don't believe any of this, don't do anything. 12 people say, get this damn stuff off the market. Okay? 7 say, traditional answer, add new warnings to the label. And 10 say, revise the label and restrict the use of the drug. That is to say, require certain tests or monitoring. They're actually not specific about what kinds of restrictions. So if you add them up this way, there's a clear majority for doing something very unusual for an FDA advisory panel to recommend. Okay? Add them up this way, it's not so clear. In any case, advisory panels come, they go. This one's very high visibility. We don't know what the FDA is going to do. That's in the future. And I'll be surprised if by Halloween or Thanksgiving we know what the FDA's ruling is going to be. We'll see. Okay? There are a lot of methodological issues in play. I won't go over them at this point. But I would say that the great divide seems to be a group of people like Steve Nissen, Kurt Furberg, and the FDA's David Graham, who say, look, we've got ample evidence that this drug is risky, dangerous, from the point of view of myocardial ischemia. We have no evidence that it's of any clinical value whatsoever, because nobody's done a valid study to show what the clinical, in terms of clinical endpoints measuring myocardial infarction, myocardial ischemic events, that this drug actually reduces their rate. And the record study is not worth the paper it's printed on from the point of view of addressing those questions because of its various methodological flaws. So they say, look, you got lots of ways of treating these patients. It's clear there's an elevated risk. We don't know how much, but what the hell? And you don't know what the clinical benefits are. Why is this drug on the market? Especially because you have other ways of treating these patients. Against that remain the view that, look, there are some diabetics, adult, type 2s, who don't respond to the other drugs and who do seem to respond to regimens involving Avandia. And besides, the data on the risks, it's soft data, it's epidemiological data, it's not clinical trials data. So that seems to be, from my perspective, the big divide. Okay? Danger, no benefit measured in clinical terms versus I need this drug for some set of patients. And it may be that the part of the advisory committee, that significant fraction says, okay, yeah, we don't want to take it off the market, but we want to make sure that it's only going to some patients, or we want to make sure that anybody who's on it is having the following tests made regularly, may represent some of that constituency. And I will also note that already we have in motion August 20th, a little after 5 weeks, 6 weeks after the meeting, that the FDA is accusing GlaxoSmithKline once again of spinning the interpretation of the July 13th, 14th meeting. And we're back to this long dance of negotiations in public and in private about regulatory labeling. So what I've been trying to argue is, look, all of this history with Avandia is interesting, it's clinically important, and so on. At least the options, the range of options, is set in motion by things put in place long, long ago. The notion of the disease and the urgency of maintaining glycemic control for these patients. The fact that the FDA, for the most part, regulates what manufacturers are required to say about their drugs. It's a misconception to say that the FDA primarily regulates drugs. It does happen. But I think it's illusory to think that's mostly what happens. And then this 90s decision about allowing surrogate endpoints and then, allowing them for more and more things. So the historian is done, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
So what's happening on the malpractice front? This sounds like a gold mine.
No idea. No idea. And, there's enough of a disconnect, so I really don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
How many more years of importation?
Don't know. Don't know. Interesting question. Steve?
It's also...
Not so much, because 99, they even if they got...
Going off in about 2 years.
Yeah. So...
15 years total?
I don't know the exact count, but it's not too long.
It's drug by drug in part, and it has to do with what kinds of patents and so on. But people who follow this thing tell me patents aren't the only thing in maintaining a competitive marketing position these days. So, again, I would say that what GSK decides to do in this has to do with its internal assessments of its competitive position and its, the revenue streams versus the liabilities. But this is not shaping up like Vioxx so far, where Merck, I think, made a clear decision to say, okay, we're backing off for whatever reason. Steve?
A few things. First, on the historical,
Mm-hmm.
you say in the timeline that they require in 1999 an RCT.
Doesn't get done.
Right, but did they actually, did they require or request? Because I thought that the power to mandate the post-marketing RCTs only came with the 2007 Act, and in fact, back then they couldn't require.
No, the regs that are issued and have the force of law, I mean, in general, you're right that they get clear legislative authority with the 2007 revisions. But for drugs approved on the basis of surrogate endpoints, they may require not only that they do it, but that the corporation have started it or have it in motion. And, but at that time, the concerns are hepatotoxicity and other things like that. So some of those trials don't get done. Some other trials get done later. And I don't know all that history, but they, by their own regs, and I don't think this has been challenged in court, if they approve something on the basis of a surrogate outcome, they're allowed to require that you have a clinical trial with a real RCT.
But the enforcement,
So the enforcement has been totally non-existent. Resources, politics, I can't tell you without doing a lot more work, but and anybody who wants can email me. I'll send them what I have as a text which has some notes about this. According to a big GAO study, the enforcement has been execrable of this requirement, not just for Avandia.
So two other points that maybe people here know and maybe don't that loom large at the hearing. One is one of the critical pieces of sort of background for conditions is the appearance on the market almost at the same time as Avandia of this other drug, pioglitazone or Actos.
Mm-hmm.
And what has made this enormously complicated, at least as perceived in the hearings, is that they both have the same class of drugs, they both have the same mechanism of action, and the criteria for approval, which did not require comparison to an active comparator like that, and in fact, pioglitazone came on the market a little bit afterwards, is different now. The territory shifts post-market. Right now, the intensive focus is on the comparison between these
two drugs,
because it's perceived that this new drug has changed the baseline to which it should be compared, and therefore it's believed that they have same efficacy, whatever efficacy that is, and that Actos does not have this toxicity. So this has totally scrambled things up. They did require in 2007 a head-to-head trial against Actos, which is seen to be the critical trial. Unbelievably, and relates to some of your thesis here, and that's called the TIDE trial. And it was designed with, in the sense of placebo arm, I mean active treatment, but without one of these.
Mm-hmm.
Actos arm and an Avandia arm, and that's only barely getting underway. And one of the issues at this hearing was, should that
continue? Yeah.
And what's interesting about it is, this is unbelievable, unbeknownst to the FDA, even though it was required specifically to look at the relative hazard and efficacy of Actos versus Avandia, that was not the primary endpoint of the trial. And the FDA did not know this. That is written in Hamburg's letter to Grassley that it is and that's just in the spring, that it is the active. So it only became apparent to the combined committees at the hearing that it was not the primary endpoint. So this has thrown everybody for a major loop. So one major clinical trial issue here. So now what happened, of course, is as a result of the hearing, the TIDE trial was stopped. And it stopped pending the final decision. And they were required to
notify all the patients, yeah.
To send a letter, and that's what this is about. And the letter, unbelievably, as this account, and it can be downloaded, does not actually really include the concern about the hazards. They're technically, everything in the letter is technically accurate. They actually report the votes of the FDA at the committee. But it's a very confusing vote. So they spin it as they voted to keep it on the market, true. And, but they don't really communicate the concern about the risks very much. If you read it, it's sort of unbelievable. So there's a very interesting clinical trial backdrop to this, which is what do you do with this trial, which may be the only definitive trial that's going to settle at least that question, but in fact, it is not the central question the FDA wants answered. Is not answered, and the FDA had neither, even though they mandated the trial, they had neither complete control over its design, nor knowledge, nor did they have control over the content of that letter, which they mandated just a few weeks ago.
Well, they never have control over contents of letters. Company issues letter, and then you go after them.
No, but they were required to issue that letter by the FDA.
Yeah.
They said what should be in the letter, but in the end,
yeah, doesn't happen. Well, so two quick things about that. I'm sorry, I can only remember one. When Avandia is introduced, one of the reasons why the FDA is willing to go along with introducing it is there's an earlier pre-Actos, pre-Avandia member of this class that has clear hepatotoxicity, and part of the selling point of Avandia is, well, we don't think there is any. I remember the other thing is, well, and David Graham and your committee, the IOM committee, Steve and Ruth Faden are chairing about the ethical issues. Both say, I think, we're not sure it's okay to do a trial at this point, given the questions that have been raised about the safety of Avandia. That's how I read your conclusions, because of this particular risk-benefit calculus. Yeah.
So I'm still going to come back to my question before. I'm a little still confused about what the FDA has done in terms of their own internal analysis of his data. So Nissen did his meta-analysis, which is not looking at individual patient data. Presumably the FDA has access to the individual patient and can do some kind of reasonable analysis.
Right. And in the I don't know, 10,000 pages of documents and testimony at the July 13th meeting, which are all available on the CEDAR website if you go looking for July 13th, 14th, different people at the FDA have done different analyses with different conclusions. Different people at the FDA do or do not agree about the issue of ascertainment bias regarding MI in the Glaxo trials and have testified to this effect. And you get, Guy A coming up and saying, I've gone to these clinics, I've done these audits, and there are real problems with reporting. And you get somebody else saying, I'm forced to disagree with my colleagues. So the FDA has done many, many things, but which all add to the information or noise, depending on how you want to read it. But they did do some of their own meta-analyses, and some of them, I believe, had patient-level data. And I can't give you a definitive answer as to what. I didn't go through each one of those, but they are on the website.
Can FDA use its powers to, if they don't have access to individual patient-level data, can they use its powers to force the company to give it?
In theory. In practice, Steve just pointed to this new thing with the Actos Avandia trial. Normally, you want to get a drug approved by the FDA for this or that or the other indication. They look at your protocol, and if they say no, we won't take this, do it this way, it's like the Marines, jump how high. Obviously, that's not the case here. So they have the legal power. Their administrative and political capacity at this point to enforce it is not so clear.
Usually, individuals are protected from trade secrets,
from public disclosure. From public disclosure, but not FDA disclosure.
I'm not so sure that FDA has access to any business, any data conducted for some commercial reasons?
For commercial reasons, no, but it does have access to trials done for anything that the company wants the regulators to do. I mean, it does have those legal powers to demand that data. Whether it gets them is not so clear. Because it can audit.
A critical thing is those studies were not looking at hemoglobin as a comparator. They were looking at that, in a sense, placebo or standard care. The central question now is not seen to be that. It seemed to be the comparison with the extant drug in its own class. So it's directly irrelevant to that question. That's one of the
You say
problems.
those data are relevant for answering the question of whether or not
It's riskier than this comparator drug in its own class. So that's this new study, and to some extent,
And that's this whole other long.
Wait, so let me just follow up. You're saying it's not relevant if Avandia has an increased risk of MI relative to placebo, doing nothing. That's not relevant.
Not literally nothing. It's other alternative treatments that are not,
If I can throw in here, both from the point of the FDA, but also another whole history that I didn't bother to get into today. Nobody in the country really has the job, not NIH, not AHRQ, of asking the question we should all be asking. What is the best, given this presentation, given this staging of the disease, what is the best possible treatment for this class of patients? Nobody has that job. And there are examples like All had in the cardiovascular field where people have tried to ask that sort of question. But it is certainly not, the FDA has been beaten down when it tried to ask that question. And certainly elsewhere, the people who do research, who fund research in this country, including the Congress, who's very quick to tell everybody how much they, not the Congress, but the researchers have, or the government agencies have screwed up. Nobody has ever said, okay, this is a question we all should be asking, and this is what we want to put our money into. And in fact, this was something that was again discussed during the Health Security Act legislation and was explicitly rejected in all formulations that had to do with comparative effectiveness and its study and implementation. Nobody has that job. This ought to be a scandal for everybody teaching epidemiology and biostatistics in every school of public health and medical school in the country, and it ain't. Because that's the question in my view. So that's the other piece here.
But that goes against the fundamental principles of medical education in the United States.
Many fundamental principles.
The physician knows what's best and has the judgment and the authority to decide what's best for this individual patient.
Yeah. No,
you can agree or not agree, but that's kind of a fundamental.
I've actually, in some stuff I've been writing, I've rephrased it in a less provocative way, which is what's scandalous is, I describe this as the principle of clinical autonomy, right? We don't even have a public discussion about where the limits of clinical autonomy ought to be. So it's not that I know, and I have I think there's some real issues here about how much leeway you give investigators and treating physicians and so on. I think they're real and legitimate issues personally. But we can't have that public, we don't even have a public discussion about that because it's been taken off the table. Nancy.
Just to add, one could still require as a matter of public policy that studies be done to answer the question.
Oh, it doesn't mean to implement it.
And that doesn't mean that doctors don't still have clinical autonomy to do
Sure.
what is best.
But
the linkage, one doesn't have to say because doctors think they know best, we shouldn't even do research looking
No,
at
I understand.
comparative.
And then their response will then be driven by the malpractice environment, not by any regulatory authority and or appropriateness of practice patterns, right? They'll be driven by their risks, their financial risks.
Yeah, and the insurance company's decisions.
Do you want their practice driven by their financial risk, or do you want their practice driven by evidence? Because they're two vastly different things.
Well, what we're going to end up with is probably what we have, which is in some cases your insurer will decide it'll be post hoc, and in other cases, your doctor will decide and will discover that they shouldn't have been treating those patients. We have a local case going on now at St. Joe's about stents. Jason, were you going to? I think Teddy wants to cut you off. You want the last question, as always, Professor Goodman. Short.
Comment. The new comparative effectiveness, patient-centered outcomes research institute is a new actor on the scene, and exactly what the place of that institution and that research vis-a-vis what the FDA does versus what the CMS does, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, well, all I was saying in return comment is I was at a conference over at Harvard in May. The head of that agency was there, and even she was saying,
head of which agency?
The AHRQ that's coordinating the comparative effectiveness. Yeah, and she said, "Look, don't look for much from us. Our hands are tied in so many different ways around the design of studies, much less their implementation." And it was actually very refreshing to have somebody in government up front say that. But that's what she said at Harvard in May. So don't look too much. Thank you, everybody.